Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Bramadette, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. Whether you've joined us live on Zoom or whether you're watching us through live stream at UVic's live stream option, or whether you're seeing us a few days from now via our Vimeo stream, we're so pleased that you're with us. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third of 5 lectures in the Values for a New World series. This series grows out of a long-standing collaboration between the CSRS and the Anglican Diocese of Islands and Inlets. In the recent past, we've hosted lectures and community engagements with Pamela Clausen, Jeffrey Stout, Dermot McCulloch, and Lois Wilson, among others. The relationship has been extremely rich, both over the years and even since the pandemic. So far in this Values for a New World series, we've heard from novelist Essia Dugin and theologian Miroslav Volf. And in the next several weeks, we'll hear from political scientist Thomas Homer Dixon and sociologist Linda Woodhead. Today, right in the still center of our series, we are fortunate to be joined by political commentator and linguist Noam Chomsky. Now, he's one of the few people on Earth, perhaps alongside figures like Barack Obama and the Dalai Lama, about whom one might really say, our next speaker needs no introduction. But as with many world-renowned progressive or radical figures, both the hagiographies of the left and the dark fantasies of the right often obscure as much as they reveal about the person and or his or her life's work. So by way of a very small effort to put us all on the same page for the stories we want to tell and think about today, let me just say a few words about our distinguished guest. Noam Chomsky is Institute Professor and Professor Emeritus at MIT in the departments of linguistics and philosophy. He's also a laureate professor of linguistics and Agnes Nelms Horry Chair in the program on environment and social justice at the University of Arizona. He is the author of over 150 books and by now nearly countless articles and essays on linguistics and politics. One of his most recent co-authored publications is Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing Discontent and Resistance, about which he was just interviewed by another John Albert Hall alumnus, Chris Hedges. So influential have his public and scholarly interventions been in over 6 decades that it's hard to imagine what cognitive science or movements such as Occupy Wall Street would look like without also thinking about Chomsky's powerful analyses of the world we share. Over his long and productive life as an intellectual and activist, Noam Chomsky has offered unflinching and prophetic assessments of our entanglements with politics, history, economics, magical thinking, and human nature. As such, we are very fortunate to have us here with us today as we think about whatever new world might emerge. I hope you agree that it's not just pro forma, but profoundly important to note that any viable post-pandemic new world we build in Canada must be a world in which we make sincere and effective efforts to reconcile with our Indigenous neighbors. And so as I wrap up my remarks, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I should note that we have invited 4 special guests to serve as the front row in what we might think of as a town hall. These special guests have all been part of CSRS events in the past, and we are really pleased to have them with us today. Today, we're joined by Elizabeth May from the Green Party of Canada, Abigail Eisenberg from the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria, David Seljak from the Religious Studies Department at the University of Waterloo, and Martha McGuinness, a former student of Noam Chomsky's and a professor in the Linguistics Department at the University of Victoria. Their questions will seed the conversation with the rest of the audience. You are welcome to pose your questions in the chat section, which my colleagues will lightly curate. And before I turn the digital lectern over to Noam, the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, Ansley Tucker, will bring the greetings of the diocese. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It is my pleasure to bring you greetings from the Anglican Diocese of British Columbia, or as we like to say, the Islands and Inlets. These lectures are made possible, as Paul suggested, by a gift from the John Albert Hall Trust of the Diocese to the Center for the Study of Religion and Society. and also by the collaboration of a working group which contains members from both bodies. And so we're grateful to them for the hard work that they have done, especially in pivoting in the ways that we can offer these lectures during these times when it's not possible to meet in person. There have certainly been some advantages that have come along with the pandemic in that sense. In these precarious times, it seems to me that there is a need not only for us to recover the prophetic voice in our midst, but also to learn to honor it. From our most ancient biblical narratives, we learn that our resistance to prophetic narrative or to painful truth is nothing new. And we also learn that we ignore our prophets at our own peril. And so I am really, really pleased that we can be involved in this project today. I welcome all of you, whether you're here in the Zoom room or on the live stream, and thank you for your attendance. And it's my pleasure now to step aside and invite Professor Chomsky to speak to us.
My turn? Yes, okay. Well, the title you've seen, repeated, Confluence of Challenges, the Fate of the Human Experiment, may sound alarmist. It's not. We are at a unique moment of human history. We're facing a question that has never risen before and must be answered now without delay. Will the human experiment persist, or will we decide to terminate it? Not by deciding to do so, but by not deciding to take the actions that must be taken and that can be taken if we have the will to save organized human society from extinction. This question arose starkly on August 6, 1945, a day that's seared starkly in memory and has remained a shadow over life ever since, at least for me, and I'm sure I'm not alone. It was not only the horrors of what had happened, but also the recognition that human intelligence had risen to such heights that very soon it will design the means to destroy all life on Earth, as it soon did in 1953, when the United States and the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons. There's a third persistent memory. Few seem to care. If I can add a personal anecdote, on that day I was at a summer camp, junior counselor. The morning an announcement came over the loudspeaker saying, an atomic bomb has dropped over Hiroshima, wiped out the city, killed everyone, the city's burning. There was light applause from everyone, and everyone on to their next activity, baseball game, swimming, whatever it might be. I remember I was so appalled, I just couldn't believe it. I took off and went off into the nearby woods and stayed there for a couple hours. Finally came back, but the memories never left. This concern, better astonishment, is shared by people whose expert knowledge and experience in these areas is far beyond mine. One is old friend Dan Ellsberg, who for years has been trying desperately to bring people to understand the nature of the abyss into which we are staring blindly. Or former Defense Secretary William Perry, his professional life has been devoted to trying to restrain the nuclear demon. He now declares himself doubly terrified by the severe and increasing threat of devastating nuclear war and by the passivity of the public in the face of impending disaster. Just mention one more. General Lee Butler, former head of the U.S. Strategic Command, the institution that controls nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons policy. He recently reflected with deep remorse on his many years of service in implementing plans for what is sometimes called the crime of omnicide, far surpassing genocide. He writes that we have so far survived the nuclear age, quoting him, by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in the greatest proportion. He then adds a haunting question. By what authority do succeeding generations of leaders in the nuclear weapons state usurp the power to dictate the odds of continued life on our planet? And most urgently, why does such breathtaking audacity persist at a moment when we should stand trembling in the face of our folly and united in our commitment to abolish its most deadly manifestations? These voices are drowned in silence. The United States has just been through its quadrennial electoral extravaganza, a deluge of what passes for debate about the problems that the country faces, but try to find a word about the growing threat of omnicide. Dealing with omnicide through nuclear weapons is one of the challenges we face at this unique moment of history, but it's not alone. When the nuclear age opened, it was not yet known that this grim era in human affairs is unfolding within a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, an epoch in which human activity is radically changing the environment that sustains life. Actually, not changing it, destroying it. The assault on the ecosystem was, of course, not sudden, but in the judgment of the World Geological Organization, the post-war escalation was sharp enough to qualify as entering a new geological epoch, an epoch that raises in stark terms the question posed by the nuclear age. Will the human experiment survive in any recognizable form, or are we doomed to virtual extinction along with much of the rest of life on Earth? That question is a very realistic one. It's impossible to overestimate its significance. We will either provide a positive answer and soon, or the game will be over. There'll be nothing left to discuss. Well, these words too may sound alarmist. They are not. And again, the words are not just mine. They're the words of the most respected specialists on the environmental catastrophe that's taking place before our eyes. They are, for example, the words of Oxford professor physicist Raymond Pierre Humbert, the lead author of the 2018 report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the highest scientific authority on this critical issue, a report that has since been superseded by more urgent warnings. Readers of scientific journals will be aware that new findings regularly lead to more dire predictions of what will happen soon if we do not take vigorous action. Per Humbert was writing in the most prestigious and reliable journal, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He opens his review of existing circumstances and options by writing, "Let's get this on the table right now without mincing words. With regard to the climate crisis, yes, it's time to panic. We are in deep trouble." He then lays out the details carefully, scrupulously, reviewing the possible technical fixes and their very serious problems, concluding there is no plan B. We must move to zero net carbon emissions and fast. The IPCC urges that this be achieved by mid-century at the latest. These warnings are almost daily becoming more urgent. A few weeks ago, the World Meteorological Organization issued its annual report on the state of the global environment. The report warns that on our present course, we may soon reach irreversible tipping points. The result may be what they call a hothouse Earth, stabilizing at 4 to 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, well beyond the level recognized to be cataclysmic. Study concludes it is more urgent than ever to proceed with mitigation. The only solution is to get rid of fossil fuels in power production, industry, and transportation. The best regular assessments of the state of the fragile human experiment are the annual reports of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They are encapsulated in their famous Doomsday Clock, with the hands set a certain distance from midnight, meaning termination. The clock was first set in 1947. The closest that has come to midnight was in 1953, after the explosion of the hydrogen bombs, 2 minutes to midnight. The closest that had come, that is, until the Trump era. Every year that Trump has been in office, the minute hand has been moved towards midnight. After his second year in office, it reached 2 minutes to midnight, the closest yet to the end. A year ago, the analysts abandoned minutes, moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. Throughout his term in office, Trump was dedicated to several major tasks. The first was to ensure the support of his prime constituency, extreme wealth and corporate power. They didn't like him, but they were willing to tolerate his antics as long as he lined their pockets, as he did, lavishly. That worked until the attempted coup of January 6th. At that point, the masters had had enough, and they ordered him out. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, other Trump loyalists in the Senate, quickly ran for the exits. Less so in the House, which is less reliant on rich donors. It's important to recognize that electability in the United States is predictable with remarkable accuracy from campaign spending. Political scientist Thomas Ferguson has shown this in very significant work. Well, they started running to the exits, but they couldn't run too far. The voting base of the Republican Party virtually worships Trump. Just to illustrate, I'll quote a recent poll taken a few days after the January 6th attempted coup, when the results had been able to settle in. I'll quote, 72% of likely Republican voters said they continue to question the presidential election results. Nearly 3/4 of Republicans said allegations of voter fraud have contributed to these concerns. These are overwhelming majorities, but even among independents, 42% said they do not currently trust the election results. That's after Trump had lost by 7 million votes and after every court had dismissed Trump's suits, charging fraud, often dismissing them with ridicule. The power of propaganda is quite awesome. The Republican Party is now torn between so-called moderates, who are well to the right by international standards, and QAnon supporter Marjorie Greene, who are close to the voting base, which remains mostly at Trump's command. Whether the loyal base understood it or not, they were worshiping 4 major policies. The first I mentioned, enriching extreme wealth at the expense of everyone else. In fact, that's a continuation, an exaggerated form, of the neoliberal assault on the population since Reagan and Thatcher. The second policy was a dedicated effort to destroy the environment that sustains life, with the strong backing of the Republican Party, the entire party, the leadership, and their corporate backers. Trump sought to maximize the use of fossil fuels and to eliminate the regulatory apparatus that somewhat mitigates their lethal impact. The third policy was to dismantle the arms control regime that had been laboriously constructed over the past 60 years and provides some degree of protection against nuclear war. Fortunately, Trump was removed from office a few days before he could complete this task. One of Biden's first acts was to accept the long-standing Russian proposals to extend the New START treaty that Trump had been delaying with frivolous objections. It was due to expire on February 5th. It's another close call. The fourth policy was to render the country vulnerable to a pandemic of the kind that had been anticipated since the SARS epidemic in 2003. President Obama had established an extensive pandemic response system. He was implementing the plans developed by his Science Advisory Board. In his first days in office, literally, Trump dismantled it. He also ordered defunding of the Center for Disease Control. That was a policy continued every year that he had been in office, even in February 2020, last February, when the pandemic was already raging. He also eliminated the programs under which American scientists were working in China with Chinese colleagues to study coronaviruses in the field to prepare for the anticipated epidemic. All of this conformed to the declarations of his favorite newscaster, Rush Limbaugh, to whom he recently gave the Medal of Freedom. His tens of millions of listeners learn that there are four corners of deceit: media, government, academia, and science, all of which thrive on deceit. A similar message is intoned regularly on Murdoch's Fox News and the few other far-right sources that shape the beliefs of almost half of the population. That's another challenge for those who hope that the human experiment will persist. Last week, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists released its 2021 report. The analysts left the clock at 100 seconds to midnight, despite their celebration of the removal of the Trump malignancy. That celebration was offset by the increase of major threats through the year: nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, and infodemic, the three major threats. Infodemic means the loss of any concept of truth or reason under the barrage of accusations of fake news, lies, construction of alternative facts, stimulation of wild conspiracy theories, attacks on science, and all the rest. The infodemic has lethal effects. Right now, in the hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths from the pandemic, many more to come. But far beyond, it's severely inhibiting efforts to deal with the vastly more dangerous process of boiling the earth. It hasn't affected the failure to deal with the growing threat of nuclear war. Silence has accomplished that. The same is true of an aspect of the pandemic that is much too easily ignored, one to which George Orwell directed our attention in his observations on what he called literary censorship in England. In England, where, as he wrote, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force, unlike the totalitarian enemy to which he devoted his famous satire, Animal Farm. There, force is used. Orwell's discussion of silencing ideas in free England was, in fact, his introduction to Animal Farm, but it did not reach the people of England. It did not appear. It was found 30 years later in his unpublished papers. Orwell had only a few sentences on the ways in which the wrong ideas are suppressed without the use of force in free societies. They're worth listening to. One is, quoting him again, that the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in suppressing certain ideas. The second, which I think is more significant, is simply immersion in the dominant culture. A good education instills in you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say or even to think. These lethal effects are operative every day. As I happen to be writing, a major story in Iran is featured in the world's greatest newspaper, New York Times. It's considered toward the left. The topic is the JCPOA, the Joint Agreement on Iranian Nuclear Programs, signed in 2015, unanimously endorsed by the UN Security Council, which ordered all countries, quoting, ordered all countries to accept and carry out the Security Council's decisions as required by the UN Charter. The foundation of international law also happens to be the supreme law of the land in the United States under the US Constitution, if anyone were to care. Hard to find anyone who does. The agreement was dismantled by Trump over the strenuous objections of all parties and replaced by military threats and brutal sanctions on Iran. These are third-party sanctions. All must obey, no matter what they think, or else they'll be expelled from the world financial system, which is run by Wall Street and Washington. The issue could hardly be more urgent. Just a few days ago, Israel's chief of staff, Aviv Kochavi, gave a most important address with the backing of high intelligence figures. He announced that if Biden returns to the joint agreement, Israel will have no choice but to attack Iran. It's possible that the Iranians might respond. They could do so by destroying the Saudi petroleum system. Happens to be located mostly right on their border in northeast Saudi Arabia. I hate to imagine how the United States would react to destruction of the world's major source of energy. You can try. We can be sure that the second hand of the Doomsday Clock would move closer to midnight, possibly much closer. The issue then is of enormous significance, but none of this enters the New York Times story or any other that I have seen anywhere. Rather, the topic is how to overcome Iranian refusal to accept US demands. The demands, in the words of the State Department, quoted by the Times, the demands are to accept the longer, stronger, but also broader deal to curb Iran's missiles and proxies, the demands that the Biden administration formulated, fully adopting Trump's program. It's a program that is self-evidently legitimate, thanks to the bipartisan consensus. This legitimacy is not asserted, it's just presupposed. That's the deepest form of propaganda. Well, it evidently wouldn't do to say, in Orwell's terms, it wouldn't do to say that there's something a little odd about all of this. There's no disagreement about the facts. Iran abided scrupulously by the joint agreement, which the US abrogated in violation of Security Council orders and international law, then punishing Iran severely for keeping to the agreement and forcing others to conform to Washington's criminal behavior. But the onus is on Iran to capitulate, according to liberal opinion. And if Iran dares to refuse, the roof falls in. Well, the Orwellian component of the infodemic, it wouldn't do to say, is no laughing matter. And this kind of thing happens daily. Those with a little sense of history will recognize what is happening. Iran is engaged in successful defiance of US orders. I'm borrowing the phrase of the State Department in a related connection to which I'll return. That's why Iran became a bitter enemy in 1979. That's when Iranians threw out the tyrant that the US had imposed in a military coup that overthrew Iran's parliamentary democracy. Well, in 1979, the United States reacted at once to this defiance. It gave its full support to the murderous attack on Iran by Washington's friend, Saddam Hussein. Finally, the US entered the war directly to ensure Iran's capitulation. Then it invited Iraqi Saddam Hussein's nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. Very severe threat to Iran. After that, it imposed harsh sanctions on Iran and on to the present campaign to destroy Iran's economy, killing unknown numbers of people, all in order to punish Iran from adhering to Security Council orders that the United States grossly violated. That's the prerogative of the international godfather, as long as silence and obedience reign among all of us. The Orwellian component of the infodemic. Well, I mentioned a related connection. The related connection is the successful defiance of Cuba. From almost the day of its liberation in 1959, the United States has been torturing Cuba. That included Kennedy's invasion, then Kennedy's major terrorist war against Cuba, brutal sanctions, virtual blockade, opposed by the entire world, except for Israel. The reasons were explained in internal documents in the early years of the campaign to strangle Cuba. That's the Kennedy-Johnson years, the liberal years. Castro's crime, the State Department explained, was successful defiance of US policies going back 150 years. That's to the Monroe Doctrine, which declared Washington's right to rule the hemisphere in the 1820s. It was unrealizable then because of British force, which also saved Canada from US conquest. But it was a goal that was attained over time as US power grew, Britain's declined. Of course, the US didn't invent the doctrine. It's a staple of imperial history. But since 1945, when the United States took over the mantle of world dominance from fading Britain, it's been a US privilege. Iran is a recent target. Well, let's suspend disbelief, in fact, considerable disbelief, but let's suspend it and concede that Iranian nuclear programs are a threat. You might look into it, but let's concede it. Even an existential threat, as Israel declares. So we ask the obvious question, is there a way to address the threat without criminal violence and possible major war? If there is, it would certainly be welcome to any sane person. The joint agreement was one possibility, but that's been removed by Trump and Biden and the free press. We should, however, be fair. The Trump, Biden, New York Times wreckers do have a point. The JCPOA did have flaws, which should be remedied. Let's think a little about them, even though it means entering forbidden territory. Let's start with the UN Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which went into force a few days ago. Unlike Canada, Iran voted in favor of adoption of the treaty, unlike Canada. That suggests some avenues to pursue. Furthermore, it's not the first time that Iran has called for elimination of nuclear weapons. A highly relevant case is the effort to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would end any threat of Iranian nuclear weapons, if there is any. It would also eliminate the threat of imminent war, which is very severe. Iran has called for a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone for years. So why not pursue that avenue? First, we'd have to know about it. Here we're back to the pandemic, infodemic. Well, are there any barriers? Not the Arab states. Now, they've been calling for it strenuously for years. Not the global south, G77, 132 countries, strongly calling for it. Not Europe. Europe's not opposed to it. What's stopping it? The Orwellian version of the infodemic. The issue cannot be discussed publicly in our free societies. The barrier to instituting a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East is the United States, backed by Israel. Every time it comes up in an international forum, the United States vetoes it. Most recently, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, President Obama, vetoed it in 2015. There's a reason. The reason is the United States does not want Israel's enormous nuclear weapons system to be inspected. In fact, the United States does not even recognize its existence. And there's a reason for that too. If the United States recognized what everyone knows, that Israel has an enormous nuclear weapons capacity, US law would come into play. US law bans economic and military aid to countries that have developed nuclear weapons outside the international framework, shared technology. So very arguably, the United States would have to cut its huge, unprecedented military and economic aid to Israel if it recognized that Israel has nuclear weapons or allowed a nuclear weapons-free zone to be established in the Middle East. Well, neither political party in the United States wants to open that door. There's no popular pressure, thanks to the power of the infodemic. But there could be. It's possible to break out of the propaganda system. And many Americans would be most interested in knowing that their government is willing to face the severe threat of war in order to protect the huge aid it sends to Israel. It's another one of those things it wouldn't do to say. Also tells us something else, something very important. Tells us that security is not a concern to planners. The decision to avoid very promising diplomatic paths greatly harms security. Security of the population, that is. Unfortunately, there's no time to go into the matter here, but this is far from an isolated case. In fact, it is the norm for security to be disregarded by planners, meaning security of the population. What they're concerned with is security of something else. Concentrated economic power, state power, population, doesn't matter. There are some quite astonishing examples. Well, so far I've been reviewing mostly bad news, but there's also good news. The Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is an important step forward. It can be used to pressure the nuclear states, those that have ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty, can be used to pressure them to live up to their obligation to make good faith efforts to get rid of nuclear weapons. It can also be used as a lever to pressure states to join nuclear weapons-free zones. It's an important step forward. I've already mentioned the Middle East, where no steps can be taken because of US support for Israel and silence elsewhere. There are others where there has been progress. Not yet enough, but progress. There was a Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone established. It was blocked by France, which was testing nuclear weapons on its Pacific islands, though France stopped some years ago. Now it's blocked only by the United States, which insists on maintaining nuclear weapons facilities on its Pacific islands. A very important case is Africa. The African nuclear weapons-free zone is complete, except for the island of Diego Garcia. Britain claims possession of the island in violation of the decision of the World Court and the United Nations General Assembly that it belongs to African Mauritius. Britain expelled the inhabitants to allow the United States to construct a major U.S. military base. It's not a symbolic action. The base is used extensively for bombing Central and West Asia, was upgraded under Obama to accommodate nuclear facilities. Well, again, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons could be used to pressure the United States and Britain to observe international law and to permit an African nuclear weapons-free zone. Another case is the Western Hemisphere. There is a nuclear weapons-free zone, almost complete, except for the United States and Canada. Canada could join, in which case all nuclear weapons-free zones would be blocked only by the United States, in one case with the cooperation of its British junior partner. Junior partner is the term that was used ruefully by the British Foreign Office 75 years ago when the US was taking over Britain's role in ruling the waves. All of this could be steps towards ridding the world of these horrors. Well, more good news is that there are feasible ways to arrest the destruction of the environment and to move towards a world that is not only survivable, but in fact far better than this one. There are careful, persuasive studies, most extensively by economist Robert Pollin, showing that this outcome can be achieved with about 2 or 3% of gross domestic product. That's less than has been spent by the Treasury Department to keep the stock market roaring during the pandemic for the benefit of the wealthy. There will, of course, be plenty of resistance to this. Actually, Western Canadians, have just had a taste in the reaction of the oil and gas companies when Biden stopped construction on the Keystone XL pipeline. This harmed the efforts of the Canadian companies to make as much profit as they can by driving human society towards extinction. Don't want to stop that. The third major factor in setting the Doomsday Clock ominously close to midnight, namely the infodemic, there's a lot to say. Not time to go into it here, but we should bear in mind that there's one fundamental component of it which is in our hands, the crucial Orwellian component that is never mentioned. Well, conclude by just saying that we do in fact face a confluence of crises. They can be overcome. We know the means are within reach. If we do not take up the challenge decisively and soon, the human experiment will come to an inglorious end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Noam. That was so wonderful. So now we have an opportunity to hear from our 4 guests, who I think will be put, oh, there they are, put into bigger windows. So the first question goes to Elizabeth May from Canada's Green Party, and you just need to unmute yourself and then you'll be put into the, there you go.
Thank you, and certainly not cheery news, Professor Chomsky, despite a few bright spots. But as a parliamentarian who's been working on all of these issues, I can't tell you how deeply grateful I am to you for sharing your thoughts with us as we try to figure out what we do about the human experiment. It put me in mind very much, your talk, of something from my childhood, Bertrand Russell's History of the World for Martian Infant Schools, which I memorized because it's short, which was, ever since Adam ate the apple, man has refrained from no folly of which he was capable. The end. So as I look at the human experiment, I try to continually put myself on the optimistic side that we will be able to avert nuclear war. And I think our younger generations are not sufficiently aware of the nuclear threat, and we have to continually remind ourselves that prohibition of nuclear weapons must be a goal. We are not sufficiently aware that the climate crisis is not just bad weather, but, as you say, a threat to our survival. And in the case of both nuclear war and the climate crisis, we threaten not only our own survival, but those of the millions of other species with which we share this planet. So in not to take too long with a preamble, most of what you discussed relates to how the U.S. Conducts itself in the world. I look to Canada as a Canadian parliamentarian, and I know on some fronts we're a little bit better than the U.S. For instance, our campaign financing rules are much better. And the infodemic does affect Canada, but our media is not as contaminated as that in the United States with Rush Limbaugh and Fox News. Still, as you say, even the venerable New York Times forgets to talk about things that really matter, like the ongoing threat to Iran or U.S. conduct in other parts of the world. So as a Canadian parliamentarian trying to get our country, not only did we not vote for the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we boycotted the negotiations on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We have done less than the United States to confront fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gases, which is always a shocker for Canadians. So I wanted to ask Professor Chomsky if you have, certainly you're more than aware of the fate of the world in many levels of analysis that most people miss. But what would you recommend for us as Canadians, those of us who are very engaged in trying to get Canada to sign the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to step up to our commitments in Paris, to confront the infodemic? Can Canada play any useful role in the world when so much is dominated by U.S. hegemony?
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Well, I think quite a lot. Americans do pay attention to what happens north of the border. Let me take one significant example. There are many. The United States is about the only country in the world, certainly developed world, that doesn't have a health system. That's a shocking fact. Bernie Sanders is considered very radical, too radical to consider, because he's calling for a universal health system. Well, there are strong popular elements in the United States who are working to raise the United States to the level of, say, Mexico or Brazil or Europe or so on. Nobody knows about that, but they do know about Canada. Americans don't know much about the world, but they know about a little bit about Canada. It's enough like us so you can look at it. And the model that is used, in fact, in the United States, it's called a single payer system, meaning the Canadian model. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily the best model by any means, but it's right next to us, so it's a model. Well, that's an illustration. Canada does something that makes little waves south of the border. And there are things Canada can do. One of them is the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Another, which I mentioned, is to join the nuclear weapons-free zone in the Western Hemisphere. It's important for Americans to notice that the United States alone in the world is blocking every single attempt to express abhorrence of nuclear weapons by denying them. Nobody in the United States knows that. If Canada made a move, might be possible to break through. Same on other things. I should say that you mentioned that Canada's record on greenhouse gases is pretty bad. It's not the only case. Canadian mining companies are the scourge of the earth. Canada has, I think, maybe 60% of global mining, and it's highly destructive. I've seen it firsthand in places in Central America where poor communities are fighting for the survival against Canadian mining for gold and so on. This is something very serious that Canada can do something about. I haven't studied it, you know better than I do, but I suspect strongly that this affects Canadian foreign policy. Somebody might look into that. Don't know if anyone has. There are lots of things that can be done right there, and they do have an effect on the United States because because Canada is a nice English-speaking white Christian country. They can be admissible into the human race. You notice them, so it does have an effect.
Thanks, Noam. And thanks, Elizabeth, for that great question. Abigail, over to you. Abigail Eisenberg from the Department of Political Science.
Thank you very much. I'll make my question short. So the infodemic is one of the 3 existential crises that you identified. And of course, that the university is in a very interesting position vis-a-vis that particular crisis, as well as nuclear, as well as the 2 other crises that you mentioned. I wonder if you can offer some tangible ways in which faculty can help respond to this crisis and in which students can help respond to the crisis in the university today.
One way the universities could help is by performing what's supposed to be the responsibility of a university, educating people in the reality of not only this world, contemporary world, but of history. Okay, where does it come from? Actually, I mentioned one example, better known in Canada than in the United States, but really not well known in Canada either, Cuba. The United States has been carrying out extreme criminal activities in Cuba for over 60 years, totally unknown. If I talk about successful defiance of US policy, nobody would know what I'm talking about, even though it's official policy since Kennedy and Johnson. Well, actually long before, but the words were used then. Okay, people can know about that. Canada could universities in Canada could teach people about successful defiance. Universities could teach the history of both of these countries and the Anglosphere in general, all the English-speaking countries. They're all the countries that fed off England, former colonies, have become great and powerful countries by virtual genocide. Okay, in the case of the United States, also, in fact, all of them, by the worst system of slavery in human history, not just the United States. It's also the source of Britain's wealth, a good bit of Canada's wealth, counterpart in Australia. That's the source for contemporary industrial development, was based on cheap cotton. Cheap cotton was the fuel of the 19th century. It was the basis for manufacturing, retail, finance grew out of cotton system, cotton futures and so on, lending, retail, commerce. That's how Britain got wealthy. One of the main ways in which Britain got wealthy. That's why Liverpool and London were among the richest, maybe the richest cities in the world. Same in Canada, same in Australia. So one thing that could be taught in universities is we're lucky, we're rich and powerful. thanks to extermination of indigenous populations and the most vicious system slavery in history. Could start with that and go on. What is missing is unbelievable. So on every July 4th in the United States, we righteously intone the Declaration of Independence, reading the passages by Thomas Jefferson in which he condemned King George III for unleashing against us the merciless Indian savages. Okay, that's what we say. We don't say what Thomas Jefferson knew perfectly well and was in fact expressed by the first Secretary of War, Henry Knox, roughly the same time. He said, we are extirpating the Indian nations by means more vicious than those of the conquistadors in Peru and Haiti. Okay, Haiti brings up another thing that Canada could teach people, namely Canada's disgraceful role in the destruction of Haiti. Goes way back. Most recent case is joining in kidnapping the president because Western powers didn't like him, sending him off to Central Africa. Plenty to talk about here. There's a lot, I could go on, there's no need, but there's a whole hidden history. And it's interesting to see how the veil has been opened on it. Until the 1960s, almost nothing was said about these things, literally. I mean, in the United States, it was scholarship. The best anthropologists, top scholars, were saying that there were maybe 1 million hunter-gatherers straggling around the country when the European explorers came. All over the hemisphere, just hunter-gatherers straggling around for us to Christianize and uplift. It was this is a couple of hundred years of history, perfectly well known to the perpetrators, like Henry Knox and Thomas Jefferson, and then suppressed. I mean, so badly suppressed, I have to admit that when I was a kid in the 1930s, we were playing cowboys and Indians, and we were the cowboys killing the Indians. It broke in the 1960s and 70s outside the universities. The first break was a scholarly work by the anthropologist in a museum, not in the Invasion of America by Francis Jennings, finally seeped into the universities, pressed by young activists who were demanding that we open the doors on true history. Same on slavery. So just 2 years ago, the New York Times, to its credit, published the 1619 series. Very good series on the history of Afro-Americans since 1619, the first day when slaves came. Horrible history, extending right to the present moment. Big factor in problems that are right on the front pages today. They were lambasted for that, attacked bitterly by historians and others. How dare you say these things about our wonderful country? Trump actually even set up a commission for schools to teach the true history of nobility and so on. But they did do it, and they did it because popular activism, Black Lives Matter, others have finally broken through. You saw it after the George Floyd murder. After the Floyd murder, the biggest social movement in American history quickly developed with enormous popular support, 2/3 support, way beyond what Martin Luther King got at the peak of his popularity. That's because of years of activism, education, organizing by many people, which laid the background for it. Well, universities can be part of this, and to an extent they are, and there's plenty of things to look at, and it has direct bearing on what's happening right now and what's going to happen in the future.
Thanks, Noam. So over to my friend David Saljak from the University of Waterloo's Religious Studies Department.
Yes, hello, Dr. Chomsky. I teach a course in religious studies at the University of Waterloo called simply Evil, and it deals with religious responses to evil in the modern world. Now, so often these religious thinkers argue that we look for evil in the actions and persons of our opponents and assume ourselves to be virtuous. And you have, over the course of your career, courageously and relentlessly uncovered and analyzed the evil present in our own society and the hypocrisy that allows us to justify it through apathy and the infodemic, as you call it, that long predates the current COVID crisis. And so I thank you very much for that. My question is, has to do with religion and spirituality and its role in addressing the challenges that you have raised today. Much of the media attention and analysis in the recent election has focused on the strong support for former President Trump by conservative religious groups, especially Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants. More recently, some have noted the rise of a religious left that is very critical of the current religious nationalism that Trump exploited. Do you see any role for religion and faith communities in the rescue of the human experiment? Do you see any such role for spirituality, often held by individuals apart from any religious affiliation or identity? So more succinctly, does religion and/or spirituality on the community or individual level have a role in redeeming the current crisis or addressing the current crisis?
Well, let me mention a few things that it wouldn't do to say. Religious communities have been in the forefront of trying to combat these horrendous atrocities. It's suppressed, of course. It's not the kind of thing you're supposed to know. But when Ronald Reagan was carrying out his vicious terrorist wars in Central America, actually the roots of what's called the immigration crisis, wiping out the countries, killing hundreds of thousands of people, terror, torture, and so on. It was to a large extent a war against the church. And it was opposed here by religious communities, including evangelicals. I spent a lot of time in the 80s going to visit churches in rural areas, rural Kansas, rural Maryland, other places, often evangelical churches, where people knew more about Central America than the CIA. Not a very high barrier, I would say, but they really knew about it. And the reason is because they were there. Something took place in the 80s that has never happened in the history of imperialism. For the first time in imperial history, people from the imperial power that was destroying its victims, people from the imperial power not only protested, which is rare enough, but actually went to live with the victims, to help them, to give them some support, to give them whatever protection you could give with a white face, which is not insignificant. A lot of them were coming from conservative, religious, even evangelical communities all over the country. It's the most astonishing anti-war movement in all of imperial history. Try to think of an analog. Nobody went to try to live in a Vietnamese village during the Vietnam War. Nobody in France went to live in an Algerian village. You didn't do it, you never even dreamed of it. But it was being done all over the United States in conservative, Christian, often evangelical communities. Furthermore, the war itself was in large measure a war against the church. The decade of the 80s, Reagan's terrorist wars, was framed by the assassination of an archbishop, Archbishop Romero, voice of the voiceless. At the end, 1989, the murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, by a brigade that had just come from renewed training by U.S. Special Forces, had a horrible record of atrocities. Many of the victims were religious martyrs right through that year and before. Archbishop Romero, who was a conservative, apolitical figure, was radicalized, if that's the right word, by the murders of his parish priests. This was all part of a much broader war against the church, which started in 1962 after Vatican II. Vatican II, Pope John the 23rd, you know better than I, but let me say it anyway. Pope John the 23rd essentially reversed centuries of Christian history, tried to return the church to the Gospels, the way Hans Kung put it in his History of Christianity. He wanted to return the church from the church of the persecutors, which it had been since the Emperor Constantine, up to the church of the persecuted, which it had originally been. So he called for the preferential option for the poor, return to the radical pacifist message of the Gospels. Bishops, priests, nuns, lay persons went out into the countryside, Brazil mainly, other countries, to try to organize peasants, poor peasants, get them to read the Gospels, which is a pretty radical document if you read the actual words and listen to them. Read it, pay attention to it, try to organize their own communities to protect themselves against the brutal, vicious dictators that were mostly imposed by the United States. That initiated a war against the church. What's more, the United States takes credit, official credit, for helping to win that war. You read the Office of the Americas, since it's been renamed, which trains Latin American killers, has what they call talking points. They advertise how wonderful they are. But one of them is the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology. That's what I've been describing. In other words, the U.S. Army helped defeat the church with massacres and destruction. Then comes the decade of the 1980s and the amazing response to it on the ground in the United States, much of it out of conservative, religious, even evangelical communities. So I think the answer to your question is it's not only possible, it's happened. It was strong enough so that it called the U.S. Army to destroy it. Pretty significant.
Thanks, Noam. And thanks, David. Martha, you get the last question of the panelists, and then we'll have some time to have a broader conversation with the audience.
Thanks, Paul. Noam, thanks so much for speaking to us. I personally find it a relief to hear a perspective that's so firmly in touch with reality. You've made a strong case that unconstrained profit-seeking is leading us as a species to destroy the basis for organized life. It's also produced high concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of a few who rely on the media and educational institutions to frame the public's understanding of the world in a way that protects their interests. An arrangement which, as we're now realizing, is not only unequal and unjust, but ultimately suicidal, or as you said, omnicidal. No doubt many of us participating in this event have benefited from this economic and social order, which in this part of the world also relies heavily on the false premise that white settlers have more right to be here than the people whose ancestors have lived on these lands for over 10,000 years. Universities and major religious organizations are institutions of considerable privilege, but with a mission to improve the lives of people everywhere. My question is, how can those of us who constitute these institutions overcome the barrier of that privilege and work across social divides to establish fair and sustainable values for this new world to come? What kinds of actions do you think are making a real difference?
Well, let's take some institutions that you and I are familiar with, like MIT, say, where I spent all my life and you suffered through being a student. You know, as I don't have to tell you, but I can tell others, when Ken Hale came to MIT from Arizona, where I now am, he was, for those of you who don't know, he's one of the great modern linguists, one of the leading English linguist, cultural anthropologist, and activist. Spent a lot of his time working with indigenous people on everything from land rights to reviving traditional cultures. One of the things he did was to bring to MIT people from the men and women from the reservations, Navajo, Hopi reservations, bring them to MIT. Technically, they didn't begin to qualify for entry to MIT, which is very high. That's how Martha got in. But
of course.
But he brought them in. He spent hours, many hours a week, maybe 30 hours a week with each person, bringing them through the graduate program, carrying them through graduate program in linguistics, which is not easy. Martha can testify. They did excellent work. They started working on their own languages. They did better work than the linguists had ever done because they knew the languages. They went back to the reservations, started cultural centers. Ken, Wayne O'Neill from our faculty, others went there to join with them, raised the level significantly, revived the cultures, revived the languages. In one extraordinary case, Ken worked with a woman, Jessie Littledoe, from the tribe that had inhabited New England, where MIT was located, before the European English colonists came and destroyed everything, the Wampanoag. Their language hadn't been spoken for a century. Ken and Jessie, working with missionary texts and comparative studies, were able to reconstruct the language. It now has its first speaker, a native speaker, in 100 years, Jessie's daughter. The tribe has revitalized. There's still remnants of it in Cape Cod. They've now got cultural centers, they're learning the language, it's revived the tribe, and so on. Things like this can be happening all over the place. In Arizona, where I now am, University of Arizona, it's regularly made very public that this university, talks always often open with it. Our university is on the lands of the Tohono O'odham Reservation, what you used to call Papago, one of the first languages that Ken studied when he was growing up here. Picked it up in the fields. We're on the reservation of their land. We have to recognize that. The university has significant programs bringing in American Indian students, American Indian studies, and other things. All of these things can be done in the universities. We could also do things like I was just talking about in the past, bring up the rest of our history, all of us, bring up the possibilities that offers. So take what David was just talking about, the history of what happened with the evangelical Christian communities is a sign of what can be done. We now think of them as just rabid Trump maniacs. It's not the whole story. They've also broke through hundreds of years of imperialist history for the first time to go to live with and help with the victims. When I visited Nicaragua, I stayed at the Jesuit house. Why? Because that's the place where I was being invited to do things and give talks. One of my closest friends was Cesar Harris, the Jesuit provincial head of the university, in the forefront of working on human rights, opposition to aggression, surviving atrocities, and so on. His own history is interesting. He was from Guatemala. He was driven out of Guatemala when the government, the US imposed government, warned they were going to kill all the Jesuits. So he went to El Salvador. In El Salvador, he became very close to Archbishop Romero. Romero was not a very educated person. He was kind of a simple person. Cesar became kind of his house intellectual. He was, in fact, the author of a famous letter that Romero the Archbishop sent to President Carter, pleading with Carter not to send military aid to the military junta, which is destroying people who are struggling for their most elementary human rights. Something quite interesting happened, which he told me about. I don't think it's in the history books. The day the letter arrived in Washington, Caesar was called to the Vatican. He was called to Rome to have an audience with head of the Jesuit order and with the Pope. There's only one possible way that could have happened. You can figure it out as well as I can. He spoke to the head of the Jesuit order, asked what he's doing, explained it. Head of the Jesuit order said it's fine. Had a session with the Pope, who was pretty reactionary. He told me the Pope didn't say stop. He just was non-committal. So Caesar took that to be an indication that he can go back. So he went back to El Salvador. A couple days later, the Archbishop was assassinated while reading Mass. That set off a huge wave of repression. Caesar fled to Nicaragua, where he became the head of the Jesuit University, where I met him. Nicaragua in the 80s was pretty much like Paris in the 1930s. Another thing it wouldn't do to say. In the 1930s, people fleeing from Nazi and Stalinist oppression went to Paris. In the 1980s, people fleeing from US terror in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras fled to Nicaragua, the one country where the population had an army to protect them. In the other countries, the army was the terrorists. Of course, the United States bitterly attacked it. Major war against Nicaragua. They managed to hold out barely. Terrible cost. The United States was brought to the International Court of Justice, the World Court, by Nicaragua. The court condemned the United States for international terrorism, ordered the United States to pay huge reparations. Of course, the United States totally dismissed it, just escalated the war. The press did report it. The New York Times reported the judgment and said, we can disregard it because the World Court is a hostile forum. That's the Times editors. Why is it a hostile forum? Because it dared to condemn us for terrorism. And since it's a hostile forum, we don't have to worry about it. That's American liberalism, okay? You come to the infodemic, who knows this? Okay. Well, what can universities do? Lift the veil. Teach people what world you're living in. Do something about it. Show them that you can do something about it, which has been done. No limit to what can be done.
Thanks, Noam. So I think we have. I think we're going to go over about 5 or 10 minutes, and we have a chance for a couple of questions from the audience. One question is from Bastien Francoise, who asks, what role does Dr. Chomsky believe the indigenous people can play to reverse the current direction the Western world has taken and that has put us in the dire situation that we are in today?
Well, a very interesting fact about the world is that in the forefront of the struggle against destruction of the environment are the indigenous people of the world, all over the world. First Nations in Canada, Aboriginal people in Australia, tribal people in India. They're the ones who have lived with nature for thousands of years. They're in the forefront of trying to preserve nature. Some of the efforts are even painful to talk about. There are desperate appeals by video, by visits, by any means they can manage, of the people in the Amazon who are being subjected to genocide once again, not the first time. The Amazon is being destroyed. It's going to destroy the rest of us too. It's one of the main carbon sinks in the world. But the first victims are the people who live there. They're under brutal attack by the neo-fascist president, Bolsonaro. Doesn't think they even ought to be there. He thinks they should get out, they should be destroyed. In fact, before he was elected, Bolsonaro condemned the Brazilian military, condemned them because in the 19th century, they didn't follow the model of the United States and just exterminate the beasts, you know. They left them there. Now Brazil has this problem with them, so let's get rid of them. Right now they're dying like flies from the pandemic. There are people who live in villages where the nearest hospital is 600 kilometers away, and the only way to get there is by canoe. You know? Is anything being done for them? They're pleading for some help, pleading to us, to us, saying, do something to save us, do something to save yourselves. This is what indigenous people are doing all over the world. Greta Thunberg became famous for turning to the rich men in the Davos conference and saying, you betrayed us. The indigenous people around the world are saying even more than that. You virtually exterminated us, and now you're betraying the remnants. We can decide to listen or not to listen. It's our choice.
There's one last question, and I asked this question because the question asker is Franny, and she's 13, and it's a lovely question. In a world shaped and curated by insidious media and social media, how can one, specifically a young person, foster clear and independent perspectives on life?
It's a hard question to answer. The social media have a lot of potential for doing exactly that, but they've also been a plague. And how to overcome that plague is not easy. They are driving many people into closed bubbles where they just reinforce each other's often worst proclivities. We see that in take QAnon, it's a striking example. It's not a small case. It might take over the Republican Party. That's half the population in the most powerful country in the world. QAnon enthusiast just got elected to the House of Representatives. Marjorie Greene was picked by the leadership to be on the Education Committee. Okay, a lot of support from Republican congressmen, senators. I was just reading this morning in the Canadian press, National Observer, that QAnon has been spreading in Canada. Okay, all of this is fostered by social media, in which people just, maybe they have a tendency in this direction, they hear somebody, it reinforces it, pretty soon they're reinforcing each other. Pretty soon you're off and running, you're occupying the Capitol because our savior was deprived of victory by the deep state or by the Satanist pedophiles in the Democratic Party. That's another aspect of social media. Well, which aspect prevails just depends on, there's no way to stop it by law. You can pass laws, they're not going to make any difference. It's a cultural phenomenon, requires education, work, organization, trying to find out what lies behind it, find the roots of these plagues. They do exist. A lot of them are rooted in the neoliberal assault, which really did destroy people's lives. You go through a rural town in the United States, the stores are shuttered, the church is closed, the jobs are gone. That's neoliberal globalization designed by bipartisan consensus to enrich the very rich and the powerful and to smash everyone else in the face. That leaves people angry, resentful, easy prey for demagogues, for lunatic conspiracy theories and so on. At every level, all of this has to be addressed. And that's the only way to deal with the growing plague of these social media. You can try to pass laws if you want, that's going to have no effect at all.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for lifting the veil today, but also for so many decades of contributing so richly to the public and intellectual life of the world, really. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank my colleagues at the diocese for their cooperation for so long and bringing people like you into our orbit and into the community, and also Scott and Rachel and others who have really been instrumental in allowing us to get together today. There were, as many of you can imagine, lots of excitement around the Zoom technicalities, but we did finally overcome them thanks to the AV folks at UVic and Scott and Rachel and others. So thanks very much. Thanks also to Abigail, Martha, David, and Elizabeth for joining and for asking really good questions. I think that drew out some of the most fertile observations that Noam made, and that I think in some ways articulate some of the key arguments that Chomsky has been making for his whole life. And so thanks, everybody. For those of you who are watching us from afar, if you have an interest in what we're up to, please just check out our website, the CSRS website, and you'll have a sense of the kinds of programming that we offer year-round. And it's we bring in lots of folks from Victoria and from around the world to share their research with us. So please feel free to join us. And the next speaker in this Values for a New World series will be Thomas Homer Dixon, who is a political scientist and will come to talk about commanding hope. And we have this lecture series that we actually run every Thursday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And next week's speaker, her slide should show up in a moment, is Maggie. And so Maggie Jones is going to be joining us from the economics department at the University of Victoria. She's a faculty fellow at the CSRS right now. And she'll be talking about issues, I think, that in many ways echo some of the concerns that were articulated today by Noam and by the co-hosts. So thanks, everybody. I wish you all a good rest of the week. And Noam will be seeing you tomorrow, I think, some of us. And thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the week. Take care.